King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. The knot of his loins was loosed, and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall, and the queen declared, "O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you, or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain enigmatic oracles, and loosening knots were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation." The first issue we have to deal with here is, who is King Belshazzar? As you can see on the screen, this is the succession of the Babylonian kings, and there is no Belshazzar among them. And so for a very long time, scholars thought that Belshazzar was a literary fiction, something the author had created, someone who had never really existed, and so the accuracy of the book of Daniel was in question. But then some discoveries were made. At the top, you see a cylinder from the temple of Sin at that's the moon god, and the bottom is the cylinder of Nabonidus from the temple of Shamash at a site called Larsa. Now, what's important about these is they confirm for us that Belshazzar was a historical person, not to be confused with Belteshazzar, who's Daniel. That's the name that was given to him by Nebuchadnezzar. Now, Belshazzar was the son of Nabonidus, and when Nabonidus left Babylon for the final 10 years of his reign, and he went to the desert, he left his son Belshazzar in charge of Babylon as co-regent. And so it's very interesting. And conservative scholars will point this out to us, and they'll say, remember that there are a number of personalities in Daniel that we cannot confirm historically. However, it used to be that way with Belshazzar. People used to say Belshazzar did not exist, but now with more discovery and more knowledge, we know that the book of Daniel is recording for us here a historical person who really was in charge of the city. Now, Nabonidus, the last king, was a devotee of the moon god Sin, the chief god of his ancestral homeland of Haran. Now, he was not a monotheist, but he was interested in promoting the interests of the god Sin, which angered the powerful priesthood of the god Marduk. And so there is some evidence that his son Belshazzar did not share his devotion to the moon god Sin, and may have led a party that possibly forced his father to abdicate and flee from the city and go to Tima in Saudi Arabia. Now, this is just one view as to why his father left. We're not absolutely sure why. It seems that it's because of the resistance of the priesthood of Marduk, but nevertheless, he got out of Dodge, he got out of Babylon, and left his son Belshazzar in charge. Here is Tima. You can see where Babylon is there at the major cross section between and Akkad. But you go way down southwest and you find Tiba in the Arabian desert. That's where the king went, leaving Belshazzar in Babylon. Now, the drama involved in Babylon when the king Nabonidus, gave more prominence to the moon god Sin than the creator god Marduk, has been attested by the tomb of Cyrus. Cyrus was the Persian king responsible for defeating the Babylonians, and at his tomb, there's an inscription that says, "A weakling has been installed as the ruler of his country," referring to Babylon. And it says, "He interrupted in a fiendish way the regular offerings. The worship of Marduk, the king of the gods, he changed into abomination." And so, if this is the case, and we're not sure if Cyrus here is referring to Nabonidus himself or his son Belshazzar. If Belshazzar led the party to have his father leave so that Belshazzar could restore the worship of Marduk, it wouldn't make sense for Cyrus to say this about Belshazzar. Therefore, he may be saying it about Nabonidus. The point here is it's very gray. But if we read Daniel and we wonder why wasn't the king there? Why was Belshazzar there in his stead? Well, it appears that there was lots of drama over the fact that Nabonidus, the king, did not honor Marduk as much as Sin, and this gave him considerable opposition from the religious community. Now, this was not satisfactory for many scholars. Yes, they doubted that Belshazzar ever existed as a historical person, and then it was confirmed that he existed as a historical person. But if he's just vice regent, if he's just standing in for his father while his father is away in the Saudi Arabian desert, then how is the book of Daniel justified in calling Belshazzar a king? He's not the king yet if his father is still technically the king. Well, there is an interesting text discovered in Assyrian, and it's right off of the border between Turkey and Syria at a place called Tel Fakheria, right? And at this place, there's an inscription found where a person who in Assyrian is called the governor of Syria is also in Aramaic, that is the language of Daniel, called the king of Guzan. And this shows us that sometimes in Aramaic, a person would be called a king even if they were only in fact on the level of a governor. Now, with this in mind, this could resolve our historical tension here in the book of Daniel. Yes, Belshazzar was not technically king because his father was king, but this inscription shows us that you might sometimes be called a king even if you were just a governor. Now, in Belshazzar's case, he was governor of the greatest city in the empire, and he was the heir apparent since he was the son of the king. And so we shouldn't come after Daniel or be too hard on Daniel for referring to him as a king. This may very well, in fact, be the correct usage of the Aramaic term based on this discovery here on the border of Turkey. Now, still, though, Newsom is representative of many scholars who are going to say something like this. The story is historical fiction that uses sometimes distorted memories of events to construct an alternative narrative about the end of the Babylonian Empire, an account that would have had religious significance for the Jews of the Eastern Diaspora. So you can see here, Newsom, she's not going to give the writer the benefit of the doubt. Yes, it has been confirmed that Belshazzar actually existed. Yes, it's been confirmed that he was actually in control at Babylon, but he's called a king, and instead of looking at this inscription as possibly resolving the issue, she's just going to say, well, he's called king in this text because the writer is employing historical fiction. She's giving the writer the doubt instead of giving him the benefit of the doubt. I don't think we have to go with Newsom and others on this. I think that based on this inscription, based on other evidence, the historicity of Belshazzar as reigning in Babylon and being called a king, that is acceptable. That is not a historical distortion. It's certainly not historical fiction. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Belshazzar likes to party. But why was he partying? Well, speculations include a coronation ceremony, a New Year's, or traditional festival. Nobody really knows. The gathering that encouraged the Babylonians to resist the Persians. This could be the case. It could be that they knew the Persians were coming, they're getting ready to fight, and so he's trying to enhance the morale of his men and trying to get them fired up and ready to resist. That would make sense. Now, it may also be a common trope here. Babylonians and Persians were noted in both classical and biblical sources as particularly heavy drinkers. And it may not be the concern of the author of Daniel that the audience know exactly why and when this party is taking place. The point here may be to show that they are incompetent as leaders because they're drunkards and they're drinking at a time when they should be sober and focused because the end of their kingdom is at hand. Now, it's a stock motif in ancient Jewish literature, these Gentile kings making stupid mistakes because they drink themselves drunk at their parties. A good example of this is Judith in the Apocrypha, where Nebuchadnezzar took his ease and partied, both he and his armies, 120 days. He leaves the general Holofernes in charge of the army. He falls in love with a beautiful Jewish woman, and after he gets nice and drunk, she takes advantage of this situation and cuts off his head. We find other examples of this in the biblical literature. Think of the book of Esther, where drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. And what does the king end up doing? He ends up commanding that Vashti appear before the men so that they can gawk at her beauty, and she's wearing only the crown. Well, obviously, she's not pleased with this. She refuses to do so. You can see in this picture here of a certain film depiction of that story where Queen Vashti is clearly not pleased. And also, in the Old Greek translation of the book of Daniel, it says here of the king Belshazzar that he is in high spirits from the wine. And so, because this is a stock motif that we find in Judith and Esther, because this old translation of the book of Daniel has it this way, we can be confident that this is the point here. Gentile kings are unfit to administer justice and to handle the business of the kingdom because of their penchant for alcoholism. Now, we should not underestimate the holiness and importance of these objects that are abducted and taken out of the temple in Jerusalem and brought to Babylon, only for Belshazzar here to desecrate them by incorporating them into a party, not just of drunkenness, but sexual immorality. You'll notice that his concubines and all his wives are present. Now, because the Judean religion did not have a cult statue of Yahweh, the temple vessels play a particularly important role in metonymically representing Yahweh and his sovereignty, says Newsom. So if you're in a different temple of a different god, yes, all these objects, the censers for burning incense, the cups for the priest taking drinks, whatever's there, these have secondary importance. The primary object of importance is the statue of the god. Well, not so with Yahweh's temple. Because there is no idol, because there is no image of the god, the most important physical objects are all these other things, these cups, these bowls, these knives, these altars, etc. So to defame these items in the mind of a Jew is tremendous blasphemy, because these are the primary physical objects with which holy space would have been associated. And they might have thought, the Babylonians might have thought, that their God was stronger than Israel's gods, and that's why they're praising them with God's vessels. All right, so again, this is an insult at Yahweh, because it's simply a way of saying our gods helped us defeat the Jewish God, and that's why we get to party using his temple vessels. Now, usually in Aramaic, the verb comes before the subject. Made Belshazzar a feast, commanded Belshazzar vessels be brought. But interestingly enough, normal Aramaic syntax does not occur in these two sentences. There is an unusual sentence construction that is employed. Aramaic here is using word order that looks more like English, where you put the subject before the verb. Belshazzar made a feast. Belshazzar commanded vessels to be brought. Now this is interesting because this is emphatic syntax. You only do this type of syntax in Aramaic and in Hebrew if you're trying to emphasize something very strongly. In this particular case, attention is being drawn to the king as a subject because he is now using his power to offend the God of Israel. He has been placed in an emphatic position in the word order to show us that this guy is guilty. It's kind of a way of saying, look at this dude. Look at what he is doing to the vessels that were brought from the temple of God. Now, did Babylon fall on the night of the party? The chapter will end by telling us that Belshazzar died that very night. It will not necessarily say that Babylon fell that night, but that may be the natural conclusion, and it seems to be when you read it. Now, the difficulty here historically is we have several different versions as to how Babylon fell, and the book of Daniel doesn't tell us how Babylon fell, so we're left with these other sources trying to fill in the gaps. Now, the Cyrus cylinder says that Cyrus entered Babylon unopposed and that he captured Nabonidus, that is the king, the father of Belshazzar. The Babylonian Chronicle says that Nabonidus fled following a revolt against him in Babylon and after Cyrus had captured the important town Sippar. He was later captured when he returned to Babylon. And again, Cyrus, according to this version, entered Babylon without a battle. The dynastic prophecy seems to say that Cyrus sent Nabonidus into exile, so he allowed him to live. Berossus says that Cyrus captured Babylon while Nabonidus was besieged in a different place, in Borsippas, and that Nabonidus then surrendered and was exiled to Carmenia, which you can see here on the map. Herodotus, the Greek historian, says that Cyrus captured Babylon by temporarily diverting the course of the Euphrates River at a time when the Babylonians were feasting and dancing. Now notice how that could align with Daniel, which says there was a party going on. His troops were able to enter the city by wading along the riverbed where it passed through the city walls. And then finally, another Greek historian, Xenophon, tells a similar story, adding that the Persians took the city by night and that Gobryas, one of Cyrus's generals, killed the Babylonian king, a riotous, indulgent, cruel, and godless young man. Now that could, of course, be a reference to Belshazzar. Now I just want to look at two of these texts, the two that line up most closely with Daniel. Herodotus says, but as it was, the Persians took them unaware, that is, the Babylonians. And because of the great size of the cities, those who dwell there say those in the outer parts of it were overcome, but the inhabitants of the middle part knew nothing of it. All right, so there was a party in the middle part of the city, and the city is big, so the people partying in the middle part of the city had no idea that they were being besieged in the outer portions of the city. All this time they were dancing and celebrating, he says, a holiday which happened to fall then, until they learned the truth only too well. Xenophon says, at last the ditches were completed. Then, when he heard that a certain festival had come round in Babylon, during which all Babylon was accustomed to drink and revel all night long, Cyrus took a large number of men, just as soon as it was dark, and opened up the heads of the trenches at the river. So Xenophon and Herodotus both tell us that he takes the city, he takes it violently, and he takes it when they're partying. Now that lines up with Daniel pretty well. Now Lucas discusses the best reconstruction based on the evidence. He says the Persians entered Babylon without a battle on the New Year festival of Sin, that moon god. When Cyrus captured Nabonidus, he sent him into exile, but the king killed by the general entering Babylon would have been Belshazzar. And so I'm just giving you a small taste of the historical issues here associated with the fall of Babylon. The Bible's version has been challenged, but nevertheless, nobody really knows what happened. But there are versions of the fall of Babylon that can line up pretty well with what the book of Daniel is saying. Immediately, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand, and the king saw the hand as it wrote. Now, this is a picture of Babylon. It was photographed back in 1932. The throne room of the kings of Babylon was excavated in 1899. Now, the message recorded, of course, was not found, and the walls were not intact. But enough of the walls is left to show that the walls were coated with a white gypsum, all right, which means that the writing could be clearly seen on the wall. Anything you write on walls of white gypsum is going to be clearly discernible, especially considering the text note that the writing took place near the lampstand. Just interesting. We find the city. We archaeologically excavate it, and sure enough, the throne room of the king has a type of plaster upon which writing would be very visible, even in a dark room, just so long as you had some light from the lamp. Could it possibly be significant that it specifies that a hand appears and writes this on the walls of white gypsum? Well, the reference to a hand may look forward to a later point in the story where Daniel's talking to Belshazzar, and he refers to the God in whose hand is your soul, or the God in whose hand is your life would probably be a better translation. And so you have kind of a pun here, kind of an interesting literary connection. A hand appears and declares the destruction of the Babylonian Empire. And then the interpreter comes along and interprets it, and he refers to the God in whose hand is your life. And so you're to understand that the hand of God, which is responsible for the destruction of the Babylonian Empire, is the same hand that is going to take Belshazzar's life from him. Also, it specifies that a finger is writing on the wall. This could be an echo of this passage in Exodus chapter 8, where the magicians say, "This is the finger of God." They say this right after God produces the plague of gnats, and the magicians fail to replicate the miracle. And this is interesting because in our context here, the wise men of Babylon, the enchanters, they have just failed to interpret the writing on the wall. And so, again, we see that the Exodus experience is on some level being reproduced in the exile. Just as Daniel is a new kind of Joseph, so the court magicians in Egypt are now being replicated by the magicians in the Babylonian court. And it could also be an echo of this text in Exodus, where God writes the commandments on the stone tablets. And so this could just be an expression of God's power, a way of saying that God is the ultimate lawgiver and Belshazzar is not. Then the king's color changed and his thoughts alarmed him. And this is an interesting phrase right here. And the knot of his loins were loosed and his knees knocked together. And the meaning here seems to be that Belshazzar loses control of his bowels. Now, loins is usually a reference to genitals here. It says the knot of his loins were loosed. And many scholars take the loosening of his bowels to refer to the sphincter muscle that governs the bladder and the anus, the relaxing of which results in the king soiling himself. There's little doubt that this was meant to be funny to the audience, all right, because the phrase loosen the knot will occur twice again in the story, not used the same way. When it talks about Daniel being able to interpret things, to solve enigmas, it'll say that he loosens the knot, and this no doubt is meant to echo this incident here and to remind you of it, so that every time you run into this phrase, you're supposed to laugh because Belshazzar got his knot loosened. And so, this is kind of dark humor, but surely it's meant to derive laughs at the expense of the blaspheming king. As Pace points out, something similar like this has already happened in the Old Testament in the account of the king Eglon, who's an evil king who gets slain back in Judges. He's humiliated by the loss of his physical function before his death. Eglon is slain in the outhouse by the hero Ehud, when Eglon is stabbed by Ehud, and it says, the knife goes so deep that even the handle got stuck because Eglon is a fat man. His death is described with the phrase, "and the dirt came out." Now, in English translations, that phrase is not usually left intact, but in Hebrew, that's what it says, and this seems to be a reference to defecation. Now, Brenner emphasizes the sexual aspect. He is hit exactly in the organs. He is employed in his orgiastic drinking feast. Instead of having sexual intercourse with his concubines, he becomes impotent. Instead of eating and drinking, he loses control and becomes incontinent. So incontinent means that you don't have control over going to the bathroom. But if it should also be meant to suggest, Brenner says, that he's impotent. That is, he cannot achieve an erection, despite the fact that he is with his wives and his concubines, and he's going to incorporate the vessels of the Lord into this blasphemy. He ends up impotent due to fear. The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." Belshazzar's promise to clothe the one who reads the writing on the wall in purple is a pretty lofty promise by ancient standards. Purple cloth was especially expensive because the dye was derived from a tiny shellfish, one drop at a time. All right, so you would need incredible numbers of shellfish to dye a single garment. And of course, this dye was pretty smelly coming out of a shellfish, but I guess they didn't mind. So, yeah, just an interesting fact on the color purple and why only the very richest men and the most powerful men were able to wear it. Then the queen enters the scene, and she's interesting because she's the only Babylonian in this frame who's portrayed in a positive light. The queen, because of the words of the king and of his lords, came into the banqueting hall, and the queen declared, "O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you, or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain enigmatic oracles, and to loosen knots were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation." Who is the queen here? Likely it is not Belshazzar's wife, because if she was one of his women, then why wasn't she already in the banqueting hall drinking with the other wives and the other concubines? She only comes in after there's a stir or a fuss. And as Lucas says, her memory seems to go back beyond Belshazzar's. And since she is free to come into the king's presence unbidden, the queen is probably the queen mother. But whose mother would she be? Some have suggested that she's the mother of his father. That is, she would be his grandmother. The Adad Gupi would be her name, and she is venerated to have lived to the ripe old age of 104. However, as some historians have pointed out, that woman was understood to have died probably a few years before the sacking of Babylon at the hands of Cyrus. It could be Nebuchadnezzar's wife, still exerting her influence more than 2 decades after Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Herodotus, the Greek historian, celebrates her wisdom and credits her with planning the formidable defenses of Babylon. So we don't know who she is, but she seems not to be the queen, but the queen mother, someone older than Belshazzar. Now, Pace points out that she's a woman, and what significance this could hold for the narrative. As she says, in contrast to the undignified and helpless king, the queen is portrayed as being wise and confident. By showing this woman, who can never attain the power of the king, as the only one who can correctly assess what needs to be done, the author discloses that the Babylonian men are inept rulers. Such use of sardonic humor may be one of the few avenues of an oppressed people to subvert a dominant culture. In other words, you have the Babylonian royalty, but the men are so drunk and incompetent and stupid that a woman has to exercise wisdom. Somebody has to have some wisdom here. And since the men are too competent to do it, this queen mother has to do it. Now, the pagan philosopher Porphyry attacked the book of Daniel at this point because it dared to show a woman knowing more than the king. He seemed to be bothered by this, to which Jerome responded with this answer that she was a woman from a previous generation who had some knowledge that Belshazzar might not have had. But either way, this is an interesting part of the book of Daniel where a woman is depicted as having wisdom in the midst of men who don't have any. Now the text refers to Belshazzar's father as being Nebuchadnezzar. And as you looked at the list of kings here, you can see that Nabonidus and Nebuchadnezzar have three figures in between them, and then Belshazzar is the son of Nabonidus. And so there's definitely, it's definitely not the case that Nebuchadnezzar is directly Belshazzar's father. Also, Belshazzar was not even a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar. Nabonidus came to the throne as a result of a coup, and therefore is not related to Nebuchadnezzar. And then Belshazzar is the son of Nabonidus, who usurped the old line of kings. And so how do we get around this? In what sense is Belshazzar the son of Nebuchadnezzar? Well, it is possible that Nabonidus, who was a member of Nebuchadnezzar's court, married one of Nebuchadnezzar's daughters. Now, this is pure speculation. Christians sometimes assume this in order to defend the historicity of the story. And it's a possibility, but we certainly can't say that with any certainty. Others will usually conclude that this is a literary device. Belshazzar does reign on the same throne as Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, so he's his son in that sense. But why would we skip so many kings and then just try to directly emphasize the connection between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar? Well, Rabbi Eliezer proposed that Belshazzar in Daniel 5 follows abruptly on the heels of Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 4, leaving all these other kings out, in order to juxtapose the story of one wicked person with the story of another. So, in other words, Nebuchadnezzar, according to this rabbi, is really evil, and Belshazzar is really evil, and some of these guys in the middle weren't so evil, and so it's more of a literary device just to kind of characterize the whole Babylonian kingdom as evil with these two guys. But as we've seen, Nebuchadnezzar is evil, he has his issues, but he is teachable. Belshazzar is not, so I don't know that Rabbi Eliezer gets it right here. But Rabbi Samuel Bar Naaman, I think, may be kind of more onto something here when he says that the gap helpfully juxtaposed Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of Judah with the end of Belshazzar's kingdom. So Belshazzar is Nebuchadnezzar's son only in the sense that he ruled on the same throne, but Nebuchadnezzar is at the beginning of Babylon when the Jews were taken into exile, and Belshazzar is at the end of Babylon when the Jews are about to get to go home. In other words, the point is to show that the Babylonian Empire came with Nebuchadnezzar and it went with Belshazzar. It came with a king that God could teach, but once they had a king who was so evil that he was unteachable, Babylon went down the drain. And so, that's probably why we skipped all these kings and we just go in the story as though it's straight from Nebuchadnezzar to Belshazzar. It's probably not that the author is ignorant of history. It's probably that he's just taking the beginning of the Babylonian Empire and the end of it because that's what he wants to show. They came, they went, and because, a very wicked king finally came to the throne, that is the impetus for God's destruction of this kingdom. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, "You are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah. I have heard of you that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read the writings and to make known to me its interpretation, but they cannot show the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give interpretations and untie knots." There it is again, that phrase. "Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple, and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. That is because his father is Nabonidus. Belshazzar is second in the kingdom because he's Belshazzar, the son of the king, and Daniel would be third. And so here again, we can see that the author understands history better than some have allowed. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would he killed, and whom he would he kept alive. Whom he would he raised up, and whom he would he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and glory was taken away from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast. And his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. And you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this, but you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath or your life, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. Then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. Now it's interesting that he doesn't know who he is. As some have pointed out, it's ironic that he would forget someone who has an almost identical name, and this may be an irony intended by the author. Belshazzar forgets about Belteshazzar. Right? There's only one syllable difference in those names, and this may be an irony encapsulated by the author to show you that it's awfully fishy that he would forget about him, and there's something going on here. Now, also him not knowing him, or not remembering him, may echo the story of Joseph in the book of Exodus. Remember, it says a new Pharaoh came along who did not know Joseph. Joseph was a dream interpreter. Daniel was a dream interpreter. There may be an echo here, but we still have to explain this, all right? Because it seems to be, when you read this, that Belshazzar has not met Daniel before now. How could that be? You know, this has been explained a number of ways. It could be that, first of all, Daniel must now be about 85, right? So he could be kind of retired. Others have given psychological explanations. Belshazzar knows the kind of message he will get from him, and therefore he doesn't want to consult with him. Who knows, right? Now, maybe he knows who he is, and he's just repressing this knowledge. For example, he knows about the exiles. You can tell this by what he says. He knows about the sacking of Jerusalem, since he's just desecrated the vessels from that sacking. Maybe he doesn't want to believe that a lowly Jewish exile is deserving of respect, and so he acts like he can't remember him. He says, "You are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah." He seems to know something about him, and indeed he seems to emphasize that he is one of the exiles. And I think Calvin gets it right when he says the king does not acknowledge his negligence, but interrogates Daniel without shame, and interrogates him as if he were a prisoner. So it seems to be the reason he doesn't know him is because he despises and looks down on the Jewish exiles, a fact that is reflected here in the way he treats the vessels that have been taken from the Jewish temple. And so this not knowing Daniel, not remembering him, this has more to do with Belshazzar's bad attitude against the Jewish people and the Jewish God than it does anything else. And again, recognize the contrast here. The story keeps inviting us to contrast Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. Twice he begins with the words, "I have heard," when speaking of Daniel's divine spirit and when saying Daniel can solve problems. Compare this with Nebuchadnezzar, who says, "I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you and no mystery is too difficult for you. Here is my dream, interpret it for me." So if you look at the difference between the way Belshazzar talks to Daniel and the way Nebuchadnezzar talks to Daniel, well, you can tell that the reason Belshazzar doesn't know Daniel ultimately must be because he doesn't want to know him. All right? He looks down on the Jewish exiles. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation." This phrase, "let your gifts be for yourself," includes no salutation, no "O King," or no "Your Majesty." Again, Calvin is right when he says, "I have no doubt that he meant to speak roughly to the ungodly Belshazzar, a man beyond hope, because there had been still some uprightness left in King Nebuchadnezzar, and he had good hopes in him. He had treated him more gently." So the tension that we detect here, I think, is very real. Now, there is a question as to why Daniel would reject the gift of the king if he's just going to, receive it later in verse 29. Why reject it now and receive it later? Well, there have been a number of speculation. He does not want to be under obligation to Belshazzar. If Belshazzar is his patron because he's just given me a special gift, or because I've agreed to a gift, then it may seem as though I'm obligated to Belshazzar in some form or fashion. It could be that he does not want the interpretation to appear connected with personal profit. He doesn't want people to say later, "Oh, it was for the sake of profit that he gives him a particular type of interpretation." It could be that Daniel uses God's gifts for God's glory rather than personal advantage. And that sounds good, but then and I'm sure it's right, but then we're left wondering why he goes on and receives the gifts later. Could it be, kind of like the way Barack Obama received the Nobel Peace Prize, even though he hadn't done anything yet, just to kind of bring attention to his set of causes? Could that be it? Maybe. Maybe he also disassociates himself from the sin of the corrupt regime by refusing to benefit from them. But again, this explanation still suffers because he receives the gifts later on. Maybe if he refuses the king a second time, that could put him in mortal danger. We don't know. But it is a strange aspect of the narrative that he uses such strong language refusing the gift just to receive it later. He was driven from among the children of mankind until he knew that the Most High God rules from the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. And you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. You have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. Now, it's interesting. Sometimes you hear people say, in order to learn something, you have to learn it for yourself. Well, the Bible does not subscribe to this logic. Oftentimes, the Bible says, look, you need to look at the mistakes of others, and you need to learn from the mistakes of others. Remember what the Lord your God did to Miriam on the way as you came out of Egypt in the story of Deuteronomy. This is decades after the story of Miriam. In Proverbs, do you see a man who's wise in his own eyes? There's more hope for a fool than for him. In other words, look at the fool and see the sorts of mistakes that foolish people make, and don't make it yourself. You should be able to learn from his mistakes. Do not be like your fathers and your brothers who were unfaithful to the Lord God of their fathers, so that he made them a horror, as you see. 1 Corinthians 10, nevertheless, with most of them, that is, those who came out of Egypt, God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness. Now these things happened as examples for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they also crave. So Paul is reading the Old Testament, and he's seeing people make tremendous mistakes, and he says, this is an example for us. We are supposed to learn from other people's mistakes so that we don't make them ourselves. Now, this is a very general point. But I think if it were taken to heart, it proves for some very useful and practical wisdom. And this is the writing that was inscribed, Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and have been found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. By far the most famous depiction of this comes from Rembrandt. This is a very famous painting. If you look at any commentaries in Daniel that have any sort of a pictorial portrayal, this is what you're going to find. And he takes the letters and he puts them in threes, and he does them from top to bottom. And one of the things that made this such a, I mean, it's a kind of a spooky dark scene, the way he does the hand. Also, the realistic faces made this a good piece of artwork. Uh, but nevertheless, Rembrandt has a pretty notable mistake here, but you likely don't see it because he put the wrong letter there at the end. You can see the hand writing right there, and what he is writing there is close to what in Hebrew we would call a Zion. You look at the bottom letter that I've put on the screen, that is like a Z sound. And that is what he's putting on the wall, and that's not what belongs there. What you needed there was a more of a longer, skinnier letter like what I have on top. That would be an N sound. But nevertheless, because Rembrandt's contemporaries were not people reading in Aramaic, he would get away with this sort of thing. It was just a mistake. The Z and the N in Hebrew and Aramaic are very easy to confuse. I don't know for sure, but I bet in the copyist traditions you can find these two letters getting mixed up in all sorts of places. Nevertheless, he mixed them up, but it didn't slow the success of his art down any, because again, people don't know Aramaic well enough to pick it up. Now, the first thing to consider about this message is that it's not an oral message, but it's delivered in written text, and this adds to its mystery and power. Few people in the ancient world were literate, but kings publicly displayed monumental text recording their accomplishments, and so written text was itself a sign of power. Now, why couldn't they read it? Why couldn't Belshazzar's courtiers read it? Well, some have suggested it's because a unique script might have been used, a code was employed, or because the letters were out of sequence or written in an unusual direction or pattern. Now, all of that is fanciful and unjustified. There are other reasons why it would be hard to interpret. Because even if you just again, Aramaic is right to left, and you just stick the letters together like that, you don't know where the breaks are, where one word begins and another ends, how you're supposed to read them. There are a number of possibilities here. And not only do you got to get the words right, then you have to be able to interpret it in terms of creating a message. And what Daniel will end up doing is he will read these words first as nouns and then as passive participles. All right? So let's take a closer look at this. Now we'll talk in a moment about how you should read these words as participles, but right now we want to talk about reading them as nouns. A noun, of course, is a person, place, or thing. And when you divide it up like this, it's in nouns, it's forms of currency. All right, so the first one is a mina, and this appears twice. Right, and a mina is about 1/60th of a talent. A talent is about 100 pounds. So a mina is over a pound. It's a big unit of currency. And then after that is takal, which is the same as a shekel. And a shekel is about 1/60th of a mina. And then you have paratsine, and this is a little bit more difficult because it can either mean half or halves. Right? It could be just half of a unit, or it could be a whole unit that has been broken in half. Right? And that's only the first issue. The second issue is it a half or halves of a shekel, or half or halves of a mina? Now, scholars will not agree on this, but it seems to me that it goes from greatest to least. Mina is the greatest, shekel is the second greatest, and then a half of a shekel, or a shekel broken in two halves, would be the least. And so mina, shekel, half, greatest to least here seems to make the most sense. So we get this writing on the wall, and it tells us we have mina, to call, and then paratsine, right? But when Daniel goes and interprets these words, he only interprets one mina. All right, in the actual message, when he says this is what this means, he leaves the first mina out, and he only interprets one mina. He interprets the shekel, and then he interprets the half, but he leaves the first one out. Now, why would this be? Well, it could be that the Hebrew text has a corruption here, that one mina got turned into two in the scribal transmission process, but it didn't originally look like that. Because the Old Greek, the Theodotion, the Vulgate, Josephus, Jerome, they all have just the one mina. They don't have the extra one that Daniel doesn't end up interpreting. And if Daniel doesn't interpret this first one, that may be a suggestion that it wasn't originally there. And so in the Greek and in the Latin versions, that they may be more original here, and our Hebrew tradition ended up with this extra mina by mistake. Now, this isn't necessarily the case. It could be that you read the first one not as a noun at all, just as a participle, where it means counted. Well, what do you count? Well, you count these next ones, the mina, the tekel, and the peretzim. If that is the case, then that would make some sense out of why we don't have that first mina. And so it may be, again, that the Hebrew text is right, and all these guys just left out the first mina because they're like, well, why doesn't Daniel interpret it? Well, they probably just didn't understand that this first one just means counted, and then it indicates that you count the ones after. You count the one mina and the tekal and the peretzim. So a couple different possibilities there. We'll talk a little bit about why it matters in the next video. Now we want to talk about reading these words as participles. We've read them as nouns. Now we want to read them as participles because that's what Daniel does to compose his interpretation. God has numbered, right? This is the same as the mina. Mina is a unit of currency, a big unit of currency, but you can also use this word to get the participle numbered, right? So God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. And then shekel is this spelling here in Aramaic can give you this unit of currency, a shekel, but it can also be a participle. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. And then again, the noun form was peretzim, which means half or halves, but this word can also be used to get the participle divided. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Persians is another word that can come out of this spelling in Aramaic. And so, yeah, we have units of currency here from greatest to least, and then we have these words reinterpreted as participles and then, strung together to create a message as to the destruction of Belshazzar's kingdom. Now, a final point worth considering is that we have a polemic against Babylonian astrology, because Babylonian astrologers would have associated the words of the riddle in Daniel 5 with weights, all right, because that's how Daniel's taken them. However, for them, weights would most directly remind them, especially in terms of this sort of mystical interpretation, with the constellation Libra, which you can see here on the screen, which the ancients depicted as weights. Now, in addition to this, the constellation Libra rises at the same time that Babylon fell, right, which even more firmly solidifies this as being part of the context. And so the author of Daniel is showing us here that it is God who judges the actions of earthly monarchs, not the stars to which the Babylonians looked as the source of their communication from the gods. Now, there are other issues to consider here in relationship to the mina and the shekel and the half, but we will look at that in the next video when we talk about Darius the Mede. So we're not done here. Join me for the next video in order to reach the conclusion.